Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, welcome to this edition of Michael Brown Unplugged. Glad to have you with me. So, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about digital nationalism. And the story starts out like this, that 50 years ago this week, at 10:30 on a warm night, University of California, Los Angeles, the first email was sent. It was decidedly a local affair. A man sat in front of a teleprinter, connected to an early precursor of the internet known as ARPANET, remember that, and transmitted the message login to a colleague in Palo Alto. And then the system crashed. Well, some things never change, I guess. And all that arrived at the Stanford Research Institute, about 350 miles away, was a truncated LO. Not the full word login, just LO. Well, today, more than 200 billion emails flow around the world every single day. And when you think about what the internet really is, the internet is really the globalization of almost everything. The article calls it a post-national public sphere, a virtual world impervious and even hostile to the control of sovereign governments. But is it really? Is the internet really impervious to the control of sovereign governments? Because when you look around the world, we've talked about this in terms of China. Nation states are responding to all kinds of crises on the internet. Some are real and some are overstated, obviously, by doing just the opposite of what the internet was supposed to do. A free and open internet, being able to, break down barriers so that people could communicate and information could flow freely all around the world. But when you actually look at what's going on around the world, just the opposite is true. So that this network, this internet, that once seemed to effortlessly kind of defy regulation, is now being, in many places, regulated to death. And of course, China has been the pioneer in all of that. The Great Firewall. In China, that firewall keeps people from reading what they want to read, what they want to do online. And that model in China has actually served as a model for promoting what the country calls, and the article keeps referring to as digital sovereignty. The efforts in China have had this powerful demonstrative effect. It's actually shown all of these other dictators around the world that the internet can be effectively controlled. And China has proven that powerful tech multinationals, we're looking at you, Google, Apple, and all the others, in Twitter, all of you, that they'll actually give up their principles for market access, and that limiting online globalization can actually spur the growth of a vibrant domestic tech industry. So a lot of countries have built or are contemplating building these domestic networks that are modeled on the Chinese example. They want to control contact with the outside world, and they want to control dissident content. A couple of examples. Iran. They've set up what they call the Halal Net. North Korea has the Kwangmyong Network. And then earlier, Putin decided to set up a sovereign internet bill that would set up a self-sufficient and self-contained RuNet. How clever, RuNet. Here's the other thing about Russia, though, and this is true in most of these countries. The bill includes a kill switch. That allows the government to shut off the global network to Russian users. And according to the New York Times, at least a quarter of the world's countries have temporarily shut down the internet over just the past 4 years. The story says that at least 45 countries now have some version of data localization requirements in place. And that trend, here's what bugs me about it. The trend is not restricted to authoritarian countries like China, North Korea, Iran, or Russia. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Korea, Switzerland are countries that are now considering restricting cross-border flow of data. In other words, not letting certain data in from outside the country and not letting data that originates in the country from going outside the country. Now, if you've ever, once the European Union's General Data Protection Regulations, the GDPR, went into effect, you probably started seeing a lot of the websites that you went to disclosing all of their privacy requirements, and you had to agree to these new privacy standards. You had to click onto the new terms of service in order to access these different websites. Well, while that's not specifically about localization, what the EU did with the GDPR is they set such stringent obligations that it really makes it hard for companies working outside the EU to move data across borders. So, in effect, that's the same thing as a government setting these localization rules that prevents data from flowing in or out of a country. So think about a company like a Twitter or Facebook, any sort of company. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a social media company or anybody else, but that you have businesses worldwide. And now countries are starting to limit the data that flows into or out of a country. That means you have to set up entirely new server farms. You've got to set up firewalls. You've got to do all sorts of things that prevent that data from leaking outside the boundaries of whatever country you might be operating in. It's beginning to show how governments can actually shut down and limit the internet, so that when you think back to that very first email that I was talking about at the beginning of the story, where we could just exchange this data all over the world, where people in Africa, or think about Phidias doing my podcast, whoever happens to be doing the podcast in Spain or Venezuela or wherever it might be, that at some point they shut that down and you're no longer able to do that. The great risk of all of this is that you've heard me use the term balkanization before. Well, what this is going to do eventually is balkanize the internet. It's going to break it up into a patchwork of all of these little incompatible and irreconcilable fiefdoms. And that balkanization could also play out in the underlying core technical infrastructure that actually makes the internet work. So over the last decade, several countries, citing cultural sensitivities, have actually considered banning or otherwise restricting, for example, top-level domain names, like .xxx, which is usually used for pornography. Well, that raises the prospect that the internet's naming system could eventually fracture, meaning that .com might not be applicable in Russia or China or someplace else. The whole purpose of this actually rather brief podcast, but nevertheless one that I want you to really think about, is that the question is no longer whether national governments should have a say, but I think now we've almost morphed to the point that really the question is, what form of authority is the government going to take, and how will that authority ultimately shape the network that we call the internet? You see, in the old vision, nation states, those were actually the enemy of innovation and freedom, the Wild West days. And someone like me, an internet purist, and I think most average users of the internet, are actually nostalgic for the good old days. I don't think that there's anything in terms of international cooperation that we can do as the United States that is going to alter authoritarian governments like China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, or anybody else, or for that matter, even the European Union, from imposing the kinds of regulations that are going to restrict the flow of data into or out of countries, regions, or nation states, or whatever else it might be. The point of all of this is very simple. The internet as we know it today is changing and changing dramatically. And just like when I talked about China last week, we just failed to understand what's really going on with China. I think in this case, we really failed to understand what's happening with the internet. We sit here and we gripe about speed, or we gripe about, whether or not there should be any sort of limitations. How much power does Google have? How much power does Facebook and Twitter have? Those are all great debates to have. But instead, what we should really be concerned about is whether or not this country will decide that we want to adopt certain regulations like the GDPR that the European Union has, and we start restricting the flow of data into or out of this country. I don't want that. I want to be able to read Chinese newspapers. I want to be able to read what's happening in South America. I want to be able to read what's happening in China or Southeast Asia. And quite frankly, I think the internet is one of the strongest facilitators of freedom in the world. And yet, while we sit here and gripe about broadband and speed, or we gripe about Google or Facebook and Twitter not allowing political ads, I think we're missing the larger picture. And the larger picture that we're missing is that as nation states like China and other authoritarian regimes begin to lock down the internet, what does that mean for us? And at what point do progressives or Marxists in this country decide that, yeah, we need more government control over what the internet does? So think about that first email. And now we've almost gone full circle. The situation is quite clear. The internet is being, and the freedom of the internet is being eroded on the fringes. And we all know how that works out. When you start eroding freedom on the fringes, it starts moving in an ever tighter and tighter circle. So watch out. Just pay attention to what's going on in other countries and watch out for this localization. While globalization of the internet may be the terminology everybody wants to use, how the internet has really forced globalism upon us, when you look behind the curtain, it's actually beginning to diminish and get tighter and tighter and tighter. Pay attention. Thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I'll talk to you tomorrow.